In topic 12, we're going to be talking about universities and scholasticism. The scholastic method is sort of the medieval method of doing theology in Roman Catholicism. But one of the great contributions of the Roman Catholic Church, really to the world, is the university system. All of these great universities that we know of in Europe really have their roots in many respects in medieval Roman Catholicism, which is where universities and scholasticism come from. Because of things like the 12th century Renaissance, the Roman Catholic Church started to reach back into the past, to rediscover the past, which, as I'm sure you remember, is the definition of Renaissance. It's a rebirth or a rediscovery. And one of the things that the Catholic Church discovered or rediscovered in the Middle Ages is a style of learning that goes back to the Greeks and Romans. And this style of learning becomes the predominant way of learning in medieval universities. And in fact, this style of learning in one way, shape, or form still exists today when we look at liberal arts colleges like Albertus Magnus College or Wesleyan College or St. Joseph's College here in Connecticut, and liberal arts colleges throughout the United States. The learning of the Greeks and the Romans was based on two things: the quadrivium and the trivium. The quadrivium consists of four areas: astronomy, music, arithmetic, and then geometry. The trivium has three parts to it: rhetoric, logic, the dialectic method, and finally, grammar. So if you were going to university in the medieval period, these are the types of things that you would concentrate on. These things became the basis, and you can see some of it here, for what we today call a liberal arts education. In fact, there are some schools throughout the United States that have tried re-implementing a true Greco-Roman form of learning. You can buy books on this, of classical learning for adults, the well-trained mind, things like that. And some argue that this is still the best way of teaching people learning these particular subjects. And you get some of this no matter what you do, what major you choose. If you are at a liberal arts college, you get this broad exposure to these different subject areas. But if you were fortunate enough and had the money to go to a university, these are the types of things you were going to learn. And on top of that, obviously, you would add theology. You would add the study of God. So in the medieval ages, young boys around the age of 10 and came from families with a lot of money, they would be prepped to go off and do this style of education. And again, this goes back to Greek philosophers, Roman philosophers, etc. Sometimes people, when they hear this, they ask this very important question of, well, wait a minute, with the coming of Jesus, don't we reject the superstitions and the mythologies of the Greeks and the Romans? Yes and no. Again, remember, for Roman Catholicism, you don't necessarily throw things out, you Catholicize things. So while this rediscovery, this rebirth is going on, Catholics are asking themselves, what's good about this kind of education? What's in it that we can take with us, that we can use to make ourselves better and to better understand the world and to better understand God? Well, in contrast to the university system that the church is going to set up, there is monastic theology. And you're going to see this tension. It still exists in the Roman Catholic Church today. I think it exists in all churches, really, in which you have people that think the best way to understand God is through education. And then there are people who think the best way to understand God is to be pious, but not be so educated. And part of why people think this is they go and they read the epistles of Paul, and they see Paul, especially in the first epistle to the Corinthians, the first letter to the Corinthians, talking about the wisdom and the knowledge of this world not being as good as dying to the self. And they hear Paul saying, all I want to know is not the wisdom of the world, but Jesus Christ crucified. Now, the irony of that is that's not exactly what Paul means. He's not being anti-intellectual there, because if you know anything about Greco-Roman rhetoric, you know he's using rhetoric while he's saying all of these things. But there is this sense that on the one hand in the church you have the educated, and on the other hand you have what we might even call an anti-intellectual movement. And this is often something we see as part of monastic theology, what's going on among the monks and what's going on in the monasteries, where the emphasis is more on prayer, doing the daily office, lectio divina, things that we've talked about, than on reading books. So a lot of times the authorities in the monastic communities had a great distrust of the study of logic, also known as dialectic, semantics, sophistry. There was a distrust of this seeking the truth, or curiositas, of this curiosity that is there with the academic life. And perhaps one of the, and this is somewhat surprising, but one of the great supporters of this kind of anti-intellectual theology was a man named Bernard of Clairvaux. We've heard his name before, and he's a very important figure within Roman Catholicism. But he had statements that he was preaching, such as the importance of being learnedly ignorant. Now, this is such an odd statement, because if you remember all the way back to the beginning of this course, I said the last thing you want when you're studying history is to be ignorant, because ignorance is not bliss. But here's Clairvaux saying, be learnedly ignorant. Be wisely unlearned. That's how you really get to God. Personal experience trumps education. And he basically saw this affects et humilitas, that the personal experience with God is the humbling experience. The problem is, if you're educated, you could be puffed up and all those sorts of things. And this tension, as I said, still exists today in Roman Catholicism. And I think it exists in numerous forms of different religions. You have the intellectuals, you have those people who just want to be spiritual. And probably the best thing you can do, but it's very, very rare, is try to combine both of these things into that great thing that Catholicism likes, the both and, as opposed to the either or. But in medieval Catholicism, particularly in the universities, Bernard of Clairvaux didn't win out. That Greco-Roman system of learning won the day. And so the type of theology that becomes really important, the study of God, which is what that word means, that becomes very important, is scholastic theology, also known as scholastic humanism. The environment, or the milieu, for this is a movement from the monastic scriptoria, to where monks were simply copying manuscripts over and over and over again and preserving them, to these urban cathedrals. And as Catholicism moved more and more into these great urban cathedrals of the Middle Ages, there became a need, an obvious need, for church staff to be educated. In fact, it just became clear to the church that one of the biggest needs in the medieval period was an educated clergy. Some argue that we need that again today. But just like you would need educated elites with education to staff secular courts, even down to this day, clearly you need it in the churches. So, at various councils, like Lateran III in 1179 and Lateran IV, C, that stands for Canon Law 18 and Canon Law 11, Lateran III, Lateran IV specifically said money should be set aside. This is part of church canon law for professors, for the very specific reason of having academics who train other people in theology, or even in these forms of Greco-Roman learning. So obviously what happens after Lateran III and Lateran IV is the creation of universities. And what the universities start out as is these are guilds of learning that are created in major European cities. And again, if you go to Europe today and you see many of these major universities that are still there, they have their roots all the way back to this period of time. What's going on in these universities is the recovery of Greek knowledge, Roman knowledge, but here's what a lot of people don't understand is the way that medieval Catholicism in these universities got back to Greco-Roman knowledge was through Muslim and Jewish scholars, especially in Spain and in Italy. In fact, if you read books like How the Jews Saved the World or something like that, what you discover is basically a lot of Greek learning was lost to the West, but it was preserved by Muslims and Jews because Muslims and Jews had been copying it and preserving it and thinking that this was actually important. In fact, we would not really know all that we know about Aristotle if it wasn't for Muslim scholars. This is something that sadly today a lot of Muslims don't know, that there was a period of time where they too were reading the Greeks and they too were trying to go about this rediscovery, this rebirth of knowledge. And the same thing with Jewish scholars. A lot of what is handed on in these medieval Catholic universities is coming from Jews and Muslims. And the other thing that we still see this today, you see it at graduation, is as you work your way up the guild system in these universities, you get different styles of robes. And those robes, you might have noticed, become more elaborate and they become longer and flowier and they have hoods and hats and all sorts of other things if you work your way up to the highest level of education, which today would be some type of doctorate. And in reality, these things are still passed on to us today, even here at Albertus Magnus College. Sometimes this scholastic theology, scholastic humanism, sometimes it's unfortunately thought of as being aggressive. Well, that's somewhat true and it's somewhat not true. It's rigorous, but all education, even liberal arts education, is rigorous. And there's a lot of misunderstanding about this. In fact, when I use this word scholasticism, it's probably best to simply think of a rigorous education in Greco-Roman reason and logic, and Greco-Roman philosophy more than anything else. A lot of people are told so wrongly that everyone was sitting around in these universities. I mean, I still hear this sometimes in Western Civ courses. Everyone was sitting around in these universities arguing how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. Nobody was arguing that. Nobody was thinking that way. And in fact, one of the things that's often missed on this is reason and logic. This scholastic theology, this scholastic humanism, what it was really interested in was the imago Dei, the image of God. And the more reason and logic were applied to studying the image of God, what a lot of scholars began to figure out in the medieval period is that that leads to what's called the dignitas hominis. The dignitas hominis is the dignity of all human beings. And this is such an important point, we're going to come back to it at the end of the class, that this becomes the very first tenet of Roman Catholic social teaching in the modern era, the dignity of human beings, that all human beings, because they are made in the image of God, have equal dignity, and they should be treated equally. Now, obviously, the church has not always done this, but back in these universities, this is what people were doing. This is what they were talking about. This is what they were studying. The image of God, the dignity of all human beings, not things like how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. Well, what scholastic theology and what the universities are ultimately trying to do is they're trying to systematize. They're trying to systematize information and apply it to pastoral settings. So this isn't just a type of university education where you simply do it to amass facts and learn things and learn data. You are doing this to help out the church. You are doing this to help out pastors, priests, parishes, people sitting in the pews. In fact, canon law, the law of the church, it really takes on pastoral dimensions in this period. It starts, and a lot of people don't know this and they don't remember this, but it actually starts, canon law, the law of the church, starts with questions about marriage. I mean, that's how practical it's supposed to be. Now, of course, oftentimes things like canon law and scholastic theology, they lose their way. But again, this was not some kind of esoteric thing. This was educators and scholars studying in order to bring that type of learning to the masses. One of the great characteristics of this type of theology is inquiry, truth, and doubt. And in fact, one of the great scholars of this period is a man named Abelard, whose years are 1079 to 1142. And in a writing known as Sic et Non, Yes and No, he has this brilliant statement where he says, by doubting, we come to inquiry. Through inquiry, we gain truth. Now, this is really, I think, a summary of how scholastic theology and even Roman Catholic theology today is supposed to work. It seems backwards to a lot of people, but what Abelard is saying is you only find veritas, you only find truth by first doubting and asking questions about what you think is true. And as you question the truth, through that inquiry, you actually gain what is true. Now, unfortunately, if you know anything about Abelard, there's a whole other story behind Abelard. He and a nun named Eloise fell in love with each other, and it became pretty much like a soap opera. And Eloise's uncle showed up one night and castrated Abelard because he had defiled a nun. Anyway, but despite all of that, Abelard is I think this statement here is really what medieval Catholicism is about, and it should be what Catholicism is about today, is that the process of inquiry, the process of doubting, is how you get to truth. This is really no different than Tennyson in his poem saying, there is more faith in honest doubt, believe me, than in half the creeds. What Tennyson meant by that line is honest doubt is how you get to faith. That there's a dialectic, that faith and doubt go together. And that's not something that a lot of Christians even today and a lot of Catholics today want to embrace, because that's a scary thing. Well, in the university system, the scholars like Abelard and others who were part of the system came up with a 5-step method called the scholastic method. I would never ask you each one of these steps, but do remember that there are 5 steps to the scholastic method. The first thing you do with the scholastic method is you pose a question, what's called a quaestio in Latin. And you use this Latin phrase uterum, whether this is the case or whether that is the case, blah, 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 blah. And you ask a question. And then what you do is you say, okay, here are all the arguments against this question, which you use the phrase videtur quod non, it seems not that, this is the case because, and then you use sources. You cite authorities, you cite cases, you cite reasons. This really is what liberal arts professors today mean when they talk about critical thinking. This is a process, by the way, that people could still use to write research papers, because that's essentially what the scholastic method is doing, and that's what we call critical thinking or critical research today. And then after you've given as many arguments against something as you think you can give, you turn to the arguments for. And you start with sed contra est. But against that, on the other hand, here's the other side. So what this method is trying to force you to do is look at both sides of an issue. Imagine that. So again, to make this argument, you're going to cite authorities, cases, reason, all that sort of stuff to say, okay, well, now that I've argued one side of the case, I'm going to argue the other side of the case. And then after you've done this, you come to the determinatio, the determination. and you use the Latin phrase respondeo, which means, okay, now that I've looked thoroughly at both sides, I respond with my answer. I think this because, I reject this because, I believe this now because. And then you have the response to the objections, which is Latin ad primum, ad secundum, and then you would say as to the first point, as to the second point. And then after you've done all of that, you would start over and go to a new question. This is the basis of scholastic theology. This is the basis of scholastic humanism. You start with a question, you argue both sides, you look at all the possible pros and cons, if you want to think of it that way. You come to a determination, and then you respond to possible objections to your determination. And again, this is a very sophisticated form of what people mean today when they say we are trying to teach people how to do critical research and critical thinking. The components of that are have a question and research both sides of possible answers to that question. I mean, that's Abelard talking about sic et non, talking about yes and no. Well, what's the argument for yes and what's the argument for no? And then what do you think? And unfortunately, this is something we don't see much anymore in 21st century American society. We don't see it on the news. We don't see it in writing. And it's, I think the lack of this type of thinking is really hurting us. And unfortunately, to be honest with you, you don't see it a lot in the church anymore, because what we tend to have gravitated towards more is the kind of anti-intellectualism of Bernard of Clairvaux, because the reality is this is really hard to do. But all of this created new forms of literature that are very important in Roman Catholic theology down to this day. One thing it created was a form of literature called quaestio. It's literature that's devoted to answering a particular question. It may be a question about marriage, it may be a question about sex, it may be a question about God. But perhaps the most important literature it created was something called the Summa. And the Summa was made most famous by Thomas Aquinas. Aquinas Hall here at Albertus Magnus College is named after Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas is certainly the most important theologian and scholar throughout all of Roman Catholicism. People still study him down to this day. He's quoted by popes, by you name it, priests, bishops. You can actually go to Barnes & Noble or even go on Amazon and buy a condensed version of Aquinas' Summa. But what you would see in that Summa, and it's sometimes very confusing to people unless they know what's going on, is you will see that scholastic method, those 5 steps. And what Aquinas did in the Summa is he gathered all kinds of questions that were out there that people were asking, and he put them under major headings in this massive multi-volume work. So he wrote the Summa Theologica, the sort of summary of theology. And again, this is people still take PhDs in studying Aquinas and studying the Summa and reinventing it for modern times. And that's why there's this hall here, Aquinas Hall, because Thomas Aquinas was one of the great Dominican thinkers, or probably the great Dominican thinker, and he was trained by Albertus Magnus, Albert the Great. The other form of literature that came out of this period was something known as the Quidlibet. The Quidlibet is a type of literature that is a debate over current controversies in the church. You might want to think of these as the op-ed pieces of the Middle Ages, but eventually they turned into these handbooks. The thing is, all of these things, whether it was the Quaestio, the Summa, or what have you, they were all designed to help out the cathedrals, to help out priests, to help out pastors, and to answer questions for the common, ordinary, everyday person living in Europe in the Middle Ages. So even though these are today seen as these monumental texts that are only academics study, that was not their original intention. The intent of going to a university, the reason why you do something like write the Summa is you do it for the people who make up the church.